Well, folks, John Wesley Wright was born in the Elkhorn Valley in Letcher County, Kentucky on April 17, 1844. His family's roots ran deep in the Appalachian soil, with his grandparents settling near what's now Kona, Kentucky, around 1815. John's father, Joel Wright, carried on the family's farming legacy, marrying Eliza Bates, their only neighbor's daughter. And as you can imagine, life was not easy in those times, but the Wrights were resourceful subsistence farmers, tending to crops and livestock like oxen, chickens, cows, goats, sheep, and hogs. Not all of the Wright children were made for farming, though. One in particular had a passion for exploring, hunting, and horses instead, didn't he, Rod?
Yes, he did, and the person we're getting ready to talk about is named none other than John Wright. John Wright's passion for those things led him to mastering horsemanship, surpassing others in the area, but it was his skills in the trapping, tracking, and, yes, hunting that truly set him apart. He became a woodsman, learning the secrets of survival and living off the land, honing his marksmanship to a deadly precision. Wright's physical appearance and his presence matched his talents. Standing tall with black hair and steely gray eyes, he was a man of the mountains, no doubt about it, rugged and capable, with a reputation that would eventually spread far and wide, and it would make him famous. But John Wright wasn't the only member of this family to gain notoriety. John's uncle, his mother's baby brother, Martin Van Buren Bates, was a giant man, standing at a staggering 7 feet, 11 inches tall, and weighing over 400 pounds. His size would eventually make him renowned all over the world, but especially in Great Britain, where he became a favorite performer to, yes, Queen Victoria.
But, Rod, it was the Civil War that would shape Devil John Wright's destiny. According to company records, in 1862, at 18, he joined the Confederate 13th Kentucky Cavalry, driven by a deep loyalty to his, quote, sunny Southland, as Wright himself later described it. It was October 4th, 1862, when John Wright officially enlisted in Whitesburg, Kentucky, alongside his close friend, Thomas Talton Hall, better known as Bad Tout Hall, the terror of the Cumberlands. Their bond would be forged in the crucible of war, shaping their paths in ways they could never have imagined.
Well, let's move ahead. July 7th, 1863. John Wright found himself in Gladeville, Virginia, now known as Wise, Virginia, as a private in the Confederate Army. Little did he know that this day would test his courage and resourcefulness like never before. Gladeville came under attack by Union soldiers from Ohio. John and his fellow Confederate soldiers, alongside members of the town's volunteer home guard, fought bravely but were eventually forced to retreat into the county courthouse.
There they were surrounded by Union forces and faced with a grim ultimatum. You either surrender or you get burned alive when the courthouse gets set on fire. The Confederate soldiers had to choose between surrendering or facing a fiery fate. John would have preferred to go down fighting, but faced with the reality of the situation, the men surrendered, hoping for a spared courthouse building. And here's where that legend starts. As the Union captain approached on horseback to meet the prisoners, John Wright seized a moment of opportunity. Concealed pistol in hand, he lunged forward, shooting the captain and seizing his horse in a daring escape.
From there, John's path during the Civil War becomes somewhat mysterious. Some accounts suggest that he fought with various Confederate units on different fronts, while others claim that he served as a spy and a courier between Abingdon, Virginia, and Cynthiana, Kentucky. His son, W.T. Wright, and others have documented his involvement in General John Hunt Morgan's raids in Kentucky, adding another layer to John Wright's wartime exploits. Evidence points to his participation in the Battle of Cynthiana by Morgan's raiders, a significant moment in his wartime journey. Initially successful, the Confederates faced overwhelming odds on the second day, leading to a rout. John Wright, like many others, was caught in the chaos of the battle. Wounded multiple times in the abdomen and thighs, Wright was determined not to be captured again.
Fate happened to intervene in the form of a farmer named Jameson Humphrey. Discovering the wounded soldier, Humphrey hid John in his wagon and brought him home. And it was there, amidst the care and the kindness of strangers, that John met Jameson's daughter Martha, affectionately known as Maddie. After being hidden by the Humphreys and falling in love with Maddie, John returned to his unit in Tennessee, and 9 months later, their son was born. But before they could be reunited, fate had more twists in store for John Wright, didn't they?
Yes, it did. In 1865, during another raid into Kentucky, John was captured and sent to a federal prison in Columbus, Ohio, alongside his fellow Confederate comrades from Morgan's raid on Cynthiana. To secure his release, John swore allegiance to the Union and promised to stay north of the Ohio River. However, his journey took an unexpected turn when he encountered a family in eastern Ohio who paid him to enlist in the Union Army as a substitute for a relative. John, now wearing the blue uniform of the enemy he had fought against for years, embarks on this new chapter as a Union soldier. Although it appears that he never fought for the Union, the war was nearing its end, with General Robert E. Lee surrendering to General Ulysses S. Grant at the Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th.
And Rod, within months, the last shots were fired and the Civil War came to a close. But the impact on Appalachia was profound, and we've talked about this before. The region was plunged into all kinds of chaos and lawlessness with outlaws, marauders, feudists, all that stuff going on in Appalachia. Those mountain feuds did erupt, with clans fiercely defending their property and provisions in the chaos. And in the middle of this turbulent time, John Wright returned to the Elkhorn Valley in Kentucky a changed man. And I mean literally changed, because his dad, skeptical due to rumors of John's death and his altered appearance, did not recognize him. But eventually he did. However, the homecoming was marred by tragedy. You see, John learned of his brother Solomon's brutal murder and his uncle's tortured death during his absence. And that's a whole nother story that Rod, share that with folks. It was a terrible thing that happened.
Yeah, it was. Solomon Wright and the woman he had been living with in Lee County, Virginia, Steve, were accused of stealing food. Just like Steve said, it was desperate times back in those days. This led to their senseless killing by several men, including the landowner, Irvin Hill. Another uncle, abducted and murdered by Unionists, added to the family's grief and fueled a thirst for justice. But get this, Martin Van Buren Bates, John's younger uncle, led a vendetta against his brother's murderers. Okay? Joined by John and other mountaineers, they captured the families of the men who had killed Martin's brother and marched them to a spot where a makeshift gallows had been erected. There, they put nooses around the men and then hanged them in a way that their necks weren't snapped, so that they would slowly strangle to death in full view of their relatives. That was the key back in those days. And you go back to a lot of old stories and you talk about hanging and so forth. The way that you really got somebody to suffer was to make sure that it didn't snap their neck and then slowly suffocated them to death. Well, those gallows were a stark reminder of the consequences for crossing the Bates family. And, you know, a lot of people don't believe, or at least don't think, that Martin Van Buren Bates was this kind of person, because he was advertised, as we'll get into here a little bit later, talking about him as, quote unquote, the gentle giant is what he was referred to. But I'll tell you, you didn't cross the Bates family. You didn't cross them for anything, and especially 7'11" Martin Van Buren Bates.
Well, and I've got to stress this too, the way, and we didn't get into details on this because it was not something we really wanted to discuss, and how Martin Van Buren Bates' brother was killed, but it was a slow, tortured, painful death that was done to him. Well, after all this, and seeking vengeance for the tragic loss of his own brother Solomon, John traveled to Lee County, Virginia to confront the killer, Irvin Hill. He found him. He was leaning against a fence with some other men, as old men tend to do. They were whittling and telling each other stories. Wright asked him, "Are you Irvin Hill?" The guy said, "Yeah, what do you want?" He just quickly shot him, killed him, avenging his brother's death, then headed on back home. Returning to Letcher County, John's life took a new turn as he became involved with two ladies, two sisters, in fact, Margaret Austin and her sister, Cyrilda. His relationships with those sisters resulted in children, adding new dimensions to his already complex life. Now, John's bond with Cyrilda was particularly strong, leading to the birth of Margaret, named for Cyrilda's sister and the mother of John's other child, Mahalia, both beautiful additions to his growing family. Despite the unconventional circumstances, though, the sisters maintained a close relationship, highlighting the unique dynamics of this particular Appalachian family.
And there's where my wife's connection is to Devil John Wright. Going back there to Cyrilda, Cyrilda marrying in Mahalia, all of this kind of comes together right here at this point, according to the tree and going back on Ancestry and some of the other genealogy sites. In 1866, though, Wright returned to Cynthiana and, well, he legally married Mattie Humphrey, settling on the Humphrey farm in Cynthiana with their son, James. Life seemed to stabilize for John as he blended in with the community. He even joined a posse to track down a horse thief, showcasing his resourcefulness and his determination. But John's adventurous spirit couldn't be contained for long. He reunited with his uncle, Martin Van Buren Bates, joining him in Cincinnati, where they embarked on a thrilling journey with the famous John Robinson Circus. John's skills as a trick rider and marksman dazzled the audiences, adding an electrifying element to the circus act. His performances, filled with daring stunts and precise shooting, captivated crowds across the country and, like I said before, even abroad, but in England and all over Europe.
However, Rod, the call of the mountains and family drew John back to Letcher County in 1868, where he settled into the rustic life of a Kentucky mountaineer with Mattie and James. But John's romantic entanglements didn't end there. He rekindled his relationship with Cyrilda, welcoming another child named Enoch in 1869. This marked the beginning of a pattern as John fathered at least 30 more children with 5 other women over the years, all bearing the surname Wright and all referred to as his quote-unquote wives. From 1870 to 1910, John Wright served as a lawman, sometimes officially and sometimes not, taking justice into his own hands when needed. And, Rod, there was one notable incident that happened in terms of this Wild West time, wasn't there?
Yes, there was, and it happened in Hazard, Kentucky, where John and his kin helped thwart a group of men led by, well, they put it in quotation marks, Captain Jack Combs, from disrupting the court proceedings. Combs had been terrorizing the court to keep his kin from being tried for their crimes, often coming armed to court just to intimidate the judge. Well, the judge had had enough of it. He'd had enough of Jack Combs and his gang, and so he goes and sends, not by picking up the telephone, but by going and sending by courier and getting John Wright and coming in for help, sort of like a mercenary, so to speak. Well, on the next day of court, like clockwork, Captain Jack and his men showed up armed and sat on the front row and in plain view of the judge and the prosecutor. Silently, John Wright and his men slipped into the road directly behind them. When the case of Jack's relatives was called, Captain Jack and his men stood up and drew their own weapons and started arguing with the judge. With swift and decisive action, John's men drew their own weapons. Then from behind, Captain Jack heard the calm, cool voice of John Wesley Wright speak to him from behind, saying, "Captain, you're covered, and every man you got. Drop that gun, stick up your hands, every one of you. We're going to have court here today. If we have to kill Jack Combs and every man in his gang." Well, Combs and his men were arrested, and taken to Jackson, Kentucky for their trial.
Now, according to John's nephew, Tilden Wright, John Wright and his men actually escorted, of all people, Jesse James and his gang through Kentucky, across Cumberland Gap and into Tennessee, for a fee, of course, $22,000, paid by Jesse James himself to keep from being captured by anyone wanting the reward money for his capture. And I guess that $22,000 probably was more than the reward money itself. Otherwise, John probably would have just taken Jesse in himself, don't you think?
Yeah, well, and another thing, too, this kind of falls into play of where one of my relatives supposedly had an interaction with Jesse and Frank James, supposedly in a cave as they were hiding out from the authorities. And he was coming along, and he was in there and stuff, or actually I should say it was my relative. It was Brandy Jack's son by one of the later marriages, and he's in the cave already, and Frank and Jesse James come into the cave, and they're saying, wonder if you could put up some poor souls for the night. And he asked them and said, well, who are you? Oh, my name's Frank, and, my brother here named Jesse. And we'd be obliged if you go and you'd set up or let us set up here for the night, and then we'll be out of your way the next morning. And Noah Mullins at that time supposedly said, he was known for telling some big stories sometimes, but he supposedly said, I think you best boys be on your way. And that was the last thing he said to them, and they left. So now I don't know. That's one story that goes with it.
Well, that's your connection to at least some part of John Wright's story. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, Mr. Wright's reputation as a lawman and manhunter grew, earning him the titles Bad John Wright for his fearless approach to dealing with outlaws, and Devil John Wright for his relentless pursuit of those outlaws. You see, the name Devil apparently sprang from the bad guys lamenting that having John Wright on your trail was like, quote, having the devil at your heels. His friendship with author John Fox Jr., whose character Devil Judd Tolliver in The Trail of the Lonesome Pine was based on John and further cemented his legendary status. In 1885, at the age of 41, John Wright joined the Pinkerton Detective Agency, showcasing his skills as a relentless manhunter and gunslinger. Over the years, he brought in countless outlaws, earning him a fearsome reputation.
And you know what? It would be just like you to go and fix this script up to where it falls on me to have to give the name of that famed detective agency up in West Virginia.
I aim to please, Rod. That's all
I know
that.
Say. I know. But anyway, however, disillusioned by the agency's payment policies, John resigned from the Pinkerton Detective Agency and joined, you guessed it, the Baldwin-FeltsDetectiveAgency in Bluefield, West Virginia. And I came across a picture of Baldwin and Felts from, I think, a West Virginia history museum. Some pictures here not long ago, probably about a couple of weeks ago. And I said, you know what? I've got to frame that picture, and I've got to put that up there next to my Union logo and throw darts at it. But anyway, let's go on for another story. By 1905, John had left the Baldwin-Felts Agency and had settled in Wise County, Virginia, where he served as a sheriff's deputy and jailer, retiring from his lawman days around 1910. Now, the press of the time, and we're talking about the newspaper and so forth, they attributed varying numbers of kills to Devil John Wright, with some claiming 28 and others as high as 99, though the exact number remains shrouded in legend. And this reminds me of the movie The Shootist with John Wayne, them trying to put a number on how many people that he had killed before he decides it's time for him to die and everything. But John Wright also became involved in the final trial and execution of his good friend Tout Hall, or Bad Tout Hall. After the Civil War, Hall had become a deputy sheriff for Floyd County, Kentucky, a position that he held for 2 years. He was also a U.S. Marshal for the Eastern District of Kentucky. Okay, you think everything's okay with that. But Hall became involved with many of the local feuds in eastern Kentucky, and yes, he didn't earn some friends, and more than that, became an outlaw, didn't he, Steve?
He did indeed. In fact, he was arrested for and subsequently exonerated of the murders of 4 men. Along with those can be added a 5th, whom Hall likely killed, although he was never arrested for that murder. He escaped justice time and time again through the intimidation he and his associates, possibly including John Wright, brought to bear against witnesses, juries, and law enforcement. His 6th and last certain killing was of Norton, Virginia Police Chief Hilton. He was arrested, tried, and executed for that crime in Wise, and we've told that story in an earlier podcast episode about Tout Hall. During Hall's stay in the Wise County Jail awaiting the hanging, a home guard was formed to protect the jail from any of Hall's friends, namely John Wright, from breaking him out. That never happened. But after Hall's execution, John Wright was the one who claimed his body for burial.
Well, Devil John Wright lived the rest of his life quietly with his wives and their 30-plus children. One of those women, Ellen Sanders, who had borne him 4 children already, legally married him after the death of Maddie in 1924. She had become a member of the Old Regular Baptist Church and persuaded Wright to join the church, which he did, and later was baptized July 24, 1929, in Bullcamp Creek in Fairview, Virginia. Forever after that, he forbade the use of the word devil to ever be said again with his name. John Wesley Wright died on January 30th, 1931, at his home in Pound, Virginia. And they said also, Steve, if I'm not mistaken, there were thousands of people that came to this funeral when he died. They were from everywhere. People that knew him, people that had associated with him, they came from all over the place. I mean, it was just unbelievable, the number of people that came.
An interesting story. All of this is. I mean, this man was, well, let's just say he lived a full life. How about that?
I would say so. I mean, he was an equivalent of he was an Appalachian version of a Buffalo Bill, so to speak,
Yeah.
going around traveling and so forth. And, he met royalty too. He met royalty the same way that Martin Van Buren Bates and his wife Anna, of course, that staged, and I don't mean it that way, staged, but that planned wedding that Queen Victoria and company put together in England for the two of them. But he rubbed shoulders with royalty. I mean, he was big time. But then you look at him and, he wasn't exactly, I don't know, your picture maybe of the perfect sort of, killer, or if you wanted to call him a killer, or, lawman or anything like that. But hey, he got the job done in a lot of cases. A lot of cases, especially with 30 children.
Yeah. He was every bit as renowned as anybody you find in the Old West. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, he's a legend.
Indeed. And that is the story of Devil John Wright of the Cumberlands, another one of the stories of Appalachia. Thanks for listening.